I want an Australia that is more than just what is left after the economic trimmings work their way through the community's digestive system. I want an Australia in which our economy is organised to support our aspiration and not to limit it. It's also my view that we can't just continue to tinker at the margins. That's what we have done, and it's clear that it isn't good enough. I do believe that we need to be bold with well thought through but bold initiatives that position us for the future. So let me put my version of a strategy to you tonight. The full version will be released on September the 2nd at around about noon on the dot in Australian Parliament House. But the strategy that we'll be proposing is underpinned by four main objectives. The first is to get Australian competitiveness right. Science, we will say, must underpin a differentiated and readily adaptable economy, one that is globally competitive and one that will enable all Australians to benefit from the opportunities that will follow. We can learn from what has been done in the UK and the US in particular. They have introduced structural arrangements that support innovation and ensure that at least a proportion of public money going to private companies is focused on areas where there is need, advantage and outcomes which can be taken to market. They encourage linkages between researchers and the business sector. They encourage the flow of ideas and the flow of knowledge into new products and services. The second pillar will be education and training. We prepare a skilled and dynamic science qualified workforce and lay the foundations, or our education and training will prepare a skilled and dynamic science qualified workforce, and importantly I think lay the foundations for lifelong science literacy in the community. People need to understand science better than they do presently. They don't have to be scientists, but they do actually need to be able to make some reasonably informed decisions. When you see what passes for debate about climate change, for example, then it is easy to persuade people who's left science behind in year 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 that a particular position is the correct one simply because it carries a large font in the newspaper or high decibels down the radio. We actually need to increase the level of scientific literacy without the presumption that everybody who takes science through school and is well taught and is inspired by the teaching, that not everybody will become a scientist, but they will understand how science works. They will understand better how scientists work. They will understand how scientists deal with probability and not absolute certainty, particularly in the experimental and observational sciences. And these are important messages to get to our community, because the debates we will have to have into the future will actually require decisions being made by people on the basis of the evidence that scientists will produce, and some understanding of that will lead to better decisions, especially when you vote. Thirdly, the third pillar we'll put in there is research, and we will say Australian science will contribute knowledge to a world that relies on a continuous flow of new ideas and their application. Like many other countries, we can develop strategic research priorities, not using all available funding to support them and not neglecting basic research that's the foundation of so much knowledge that we can apply, but we can and should align and focus and scale. And somewhat to my surprise, when I started to think about and talk about this, and I visited my counterpart in the United States to find that the United States has been putting out research priorities to focus funding for 40 years. And they can actually show you, quite convincingly, how that has affected the profile of research that's done in the United States. So we all think that all they do in a rich country with a big economy is toss money in the air and people grab it and go away and do what they want to do. And that's true for a proportion of their funding. But there is a proportion, and federal government departments and agencies are required to acquit a proportion of their funding against the priorities that are established. Overnight, last night, they released a similar set of criteria for intergovernmental, interagency research to break down the silos that traditionally exist between departments and agencies, where decisions are taken individually, not collectively, to ensure, for example, that as they make their decisions on their budget priorities and processes, that they don't simply eliminate a discipline over a short period of time because they're all making their decisions for their own purposes, legitimately so, but without an eye to the main game. And that is that there are some disciplines we've got to make sure that we keep in Australia, even if at present they're not popular. The fourth pillar will be international engagement. Australian science, we will say, will position Australia as a respected, important and able partner in a changing world for both domestic and global benefit. There is no point in us, I think, pretending that we are exclusively altruistic in this country and that all we will do is spend money somewhere else for the benefit of everybody else but us. Most of the strategic partnerships that are really working well for Australia, not the ones with individual researchers, engaged with individual researchers in other countries, but where we have country-to-country relationships, then what we actually see is that with some priority area where we share a common problem or we share particular advantages or whatever it might be, that putting strategically emphasis on that means that we do build capacity, we do build capability, and we can solve problems to our own benefit, but at the same time to the benefit of our partner countries. So we are in favour, well, all right, I am in favour of developing strategic government-to-government partnerships that are funded. As a Vice-Chancellor, I'm sure like yours, although he's a wiser man than me, but as a Vice-Chancellor, I had filing cabinets full of memoranda of understanding because they were convenient things to do for us and for visitors. Very few of them ever put rubber on the road. Little point in doing that. I know that there are government-to-government memoranda of understanding without funding. Not much point in doing that either. If you measure it in terms of metres of paper, it looks good, but in terms of function and what we achieve through those, we're better to have fewer and better to have ones that are much more strategic. And a strategy has got to be determined by advice. It's not the whim of a single minister or a single chief scientist or a group, single person, small group. It is a direction that's taken with an appropriate advisory structure, although I have learnt over my many years that you can consult too much. But I think also that we should look to using better the Australian science base and work within our region. So we will be proposing to establish an Asian Area Research Zone that facilitates work on shared priorities as well as building shared infrastructure. Too often I think that we've all got to have one of something big, and frequently it's not always, well, it's not always optimal, and I think with an appropriate set of arrangements we can make all of that work better and provide real research infrastructure, up-to-date, state-of-the-art research infrastructure for scientists in the countries in our region as well as our own. So if we were to do all that, what would such a strategy cost? Well, I think it would cost only effort, it would cost only commitment, and it would cost only willpower. What are the costs of inaction? What would be the deficit that we would leave behind if we did nothing? I hope our children don't find out. The choice is ours to make. That is why we take inspiration, and we should take inspiration from people like Jack Beale, people who thought deeply and who acted boldly.